Back in the garage today, we're going to be working on my brother's Jeep Wrangler. It's a 2016. Back a few weeks ago, started making a noise. We thought it was the throwout bearing, so we brought it in here, threw it on the lift, replaced the clutch, got it back down, and it was still making a noise. So we decided to just go with a rebuilt transmission. Transmission in these Jeeps is an NSG 370. He ordered this from High Gear of Memphis, Tennessee. So we'll get it on the lift and take you guys along with us. All right, so first things first, moving inside, you got to pull your transfer case down into 4-low. That way you can get the center console off, pull off both of the shift handles. Then you can pop the clips and pull the center console out. Then there's a little flat nut down there you gotta twist off. That way you can get the rubber boot out. And then down inside of there, we're just going to take out these 4 Torx bolts directly out of the shift tower, and we'll pull it all out as a unit. So your shift tower bolts are going to be a T30. With the shift tower out, make sure you grab your gasket, and at that point you can throw it on the lift and start taking the underside apart. Alright, so now that we got it up on the lift, first thing we're going to do is take out the rear drive shaft. It's going to be an 8mm socket for both your CV joints. Then we'll take out the front drive shaft, again 8mm socket on your CV joint in the rear, 15mm socket for the universal joint in the front. Then you can pull out your cross member, support the transmission with the transmission jack. At that point, you can take your cross member out, move your support over to your transmission. You can take your exhaust apart, pull the transfer case off, and then you're ready to pull the transmission. So let's get into it. Then to get your CV joint apart, it's easier if you go on the right side of the rear diff. As you spin it around, you'll see one hole that's not for a bolt on both sides. As you spin that around, if you take a punch and hit that with a hammer, that's how you knock your CV joints apart. On the front end of this rear drive shaft, there's a little hole right there. You can slip a small punch in since you can't get to the back of it to drive it out like we did the rear. Okay, with the skid plate out of the way, before we take the cross member out and have to support the transmission, we're going to take the manifold bolts off, and there's one clamp on the exhaust right here. Instead of taking the whole exhaust apart, we're just going to take it loose and twist this piece down out of the way. So with the exhaust down out of the way, got the transmission jack in place. That'll support the transmission and the transfer case while we take the cross member out. Just gonna be 2 bolts over here, 2 bolts over there behind the exhaust, and then 2 nuts up here. You can take this middle spacer off, but you don't necessarily have to if the whole cross member is coming out. Alright, so now you gotta let your jack down and have one guy hold everything up. The other guy move the transmission jack over, that way you can take the pressure off the transfer case to get it down out of your way. Okay, with your transmission jack moved over, you got a couple things to take apart. First is going to be your shift linkage. Should be a little black clip right here that you can squeeze together and pull straight down. Sometimes they get brittle and break, so that's why ours is zip tied together. Up there in the back where the end of the link actually meets the shifter arm, you can just pull that towards the outside of the vehicle and it'll pop off. Then you've got 6 14mm nuts to take off. There's 3 on this side, 3 on the other side. Make sure when you take those off, you hold this bracket so it doesn't come down and try to hit you in the face. There is a couple clips up here. I don't know for sure if they're on the transmission or not, but just make sure your wiring's all out of the way. And most importantly, up here on top, you've got your indicator that goes to the dash to tell you when you're in 4-wheel drive or not. Make sure you unplug that. Okay, so once you get all your nuts off, you can leave your top 2 just to hold the transfer case up. And a couple guys, if you hold it in, there's locating pins that'll keep it from falling down. Put some pressure on it, take the other 2 nuts off, and then the 2 guys can just set the transfer case down. There's also a vent tube on top of the transfer case that you gotta pull off too. With the transfer case out of the way, you got a few more things to take apart. First, you got to take off your neutral select wire. That's just a safety. That way you don't start it in gear. You got 2 1/2-inch nuts. Take your slave cylinder out for your clutch. Then you have 12 15mm bolts to take out that actually separates the transmission from the engine. Over here on this side, there's one 7/16 bolt right there that mounts the fuel lines to the side of the transmission. Once you take all that apart, then you're ready to pull the transmission out. Okay, so now that we've got all the wires and bolts and everything out, there's 2 more that's holding it in right now. What we're going to do is we're going to grab onto it, pull those bolts out, try to push the brackets and stuff out of the way. There's a couple brackets up on top that will get caught on the lip of the bell housing. So we'll try to push those out of the way, shimmy it off of the output shaft of the motor, and then we'll bring it down and set it on the bench. I believe so. Yeah. Just have an arm pin in the transmission in it. Ready? Put some flange. Yep. We were in here not too long ago and just put a brand new clutch in it, so we know that that's all good. Flywheel and starter are good. So at this point, we're ready to start swapping parts on the transmissions. Okay, so with it sitting on the bench, this is old, that's new. There's a few pieces you got to swap over. First is the bracket on the bottom that allows it to mount to the crossmember. You got to swap over your neutral selector switch. You have to pull the studs out for your slave cylinder, swap that over to the new one. And you got to pull out your throwout bearing. Like I just said, this is all brand new stuff. You've got a brand new pilot bearing, brand new throwout bearing, and brand new clutch. So I know that that bearing is good. and this is the new guy, all empty. Okay, so to take these studs out, you can just take a 5mm socket. These are set up for a special tool, but a 5mm socket works assuming they're not super tight. If that doesn't work, you can also put 2 nuts together and pull them out that way. Be real careful with them. If you're using a 6-point socket like I am, this is not a square or a hexagonal head. You can mess the spines up. Next thing you want to do is pull the throwout bearing out. On the left side here, there's a little retainer clip. Just pull straight out on it. That'll pop loose and the whole bearing will come out. The way this is made, this little clip right here fits over the end, and that will snap over this little ball to keep it in place. That way it can actuate in and out. Alright, so moving on to the new transmission. To put these studs back in for the slave cylinder, I'm going to take them and put a little bit of blue Loctite on them. Just start them by hand. Tighten them up here in just a second. Okay, then back with just using the 5mm socket trick again. They need to be tight, but they don't need to be snap off tight. I'd say that's good. Okay, so throw your new throwout bearing in. You don't want to put any grease on this. You kind of want that to be mostly dry, but you do want to grease up your shaft. Typically, probably works better if you take some white lithium grease. I'm getting ready to rebuild the motor, so assembly lube is what I have on hand. Just want to put a little on there and lube the shaft up. Something to allow that bearing to slide in and out. And you also want to get some on the splines. That way it makes it easier to mate with the with the engine when you go to put it back together. Then take your throwout bearing. Snap it back on, and that's all there is to it. And last thing you want to do before you put it back in, set your shift tower down in there and just throw it into gear. That way when you're trying to make the front end of the transmission line up with the splines on the motor, you can spin the tail shaft and it'll spin the front. That way you can slip the gears in. You don't have to worry about lining directly up. All right, now that we have all the parts and pieces swapped over to the new transmission, we're gonna go ahead and put it in the truck. Well, from that point forward, to kind of do everything we just did in reverse, so I'm not going to make you sit through that. Alright, now that we got the transmission back up in there, we're going to start putting some fluid in it. You're going to need a 14mm hex socket. We're going to use Synchromax synthetic manual transmission fluid. Then we just got a transfer pump. Basically just fill it up until it runs out the hole, and that's how you know it's full. Might not be perfectly level since it's right here on the lift, but once we get it back on the floor, we'll double check the level. This thing takes right at 2 quarts. So put the cap back in, we'll finish putting it back together, and when we get it on the floor, we'll double check the level. That's the last thing we need to do under here. We'll pull it down off the lift and double check fluid. So now that we got it back down on the floor, we're going to pull the fill plug out again and see if it's at the right level. I would imagine we might have gotten it a little bit full with it being tilted back on the lift.
Pretty close. Right at the dripper, but it's not coming out. Cool, so that should be good.
Okay, so now we're back inside. Last thing to wrap this up is to put the shift tower in. We're going to take the gasket and lay it down in there. Then we'll take the shift tower, set it in. Just be careful to not knock your gasket off. And drop the bolts in. So then you just want to tighten up all your bolts. If I was to do this again, I would probably recommend splitting the shaft right here and take the shift tower off above the transmission whenever you're taking it out. Okay, once you get your bolts on your shift tower tight, then you got to put the boot back on. Make sure it seats all the way down and the stud comes through, and then you can put your little flat nut back on. And last but not least, pop the console in. I guess the last thing is to snap on your shift knobs. And then you're done. All right, well, that's it for replacing a transmission on a 2016 Jeep Wrangler. That'll be applicable to all of your Jeep JKUs. JK will be similar, but with it being shorter, your drive shafts might be a little bit different length. A couple things I forgot to mention in the video. I know I talked about leaving the transmission in gear. That way you can grab the tail shaft and twist it as you slide it up into the motor. As far as the transfer case, when you're pulling the drive shaft, you want it to be in neutral so you can spin the drive shaft and get to the bolts at the bottom. Don't really have enough room to get to all those bolts up on top. But for the same reason, you want it to be in gear whenever you go to put it back in. That way you can spin the tail shaft of the transfer case to match it up to the transmission. But yeah, I hope that helps somebody out. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you in a day or two.